I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't sure if I'd ever get to play Crackdown 3. I love the original, and I was definitely excited when a second sequel finally got announced. But that was way back in 2014. Since then, gamers like myself have had to wait through radio silence and multiple delays, and it seemed like the game was in serious trouble for a long time. Even having a big-name actor like Terry Crews attached didn't do much to inspire confidence, even as Microsoft continued to promise fans that the game would be a worthy follow-up. Now that it's finally out, gamers finally have a chance to see if it was worth the wait. Crackdown 3 is definitely a throwback to an older generation of open-world action games, but is a sandbox full of agility orbs, over-the-top gunfights, and witty banter really enough to carry a game in 2019? In terms of story, there isn't much to speak of. There's plenty of setup, sure, but the actual plot of the game is pretty thin. You are an agent of the, agency. An elite, genetically modified, superpowered police force. The agency is tasked with taking down Terra Nova, a combination of every evil megacorporation in popular culture, before they can take over the world. Of course, there's a local resistance led by a plucky young ideologist, and it's up to the player to help liberate the oppressed masses while blowing up bad guys along the way. If that description didn't already make it obvious, Crackdown 3 doesn't have much of a story. Cutscenes are few and far between, and though there is some interesting characterization here and there, it's obvious that the story was never going to be the game's main focus. It's mostly NPCs yelling at the player about who they're fighting and what's going on. These are the bad guys, they do bad things. Or, this chemical is bad, we need to stop the bad guys from making it. There is some decent world building tucked away in hidden audio logs, but that's as deep as the narrative ever gets. Strangely, there's no real connection to the rest of the series past a few offhand remarks. Granted, that's probably for the best, but as someone who played the previous games, it is a little odd. Unfortunately, the weak story leads to an even weaker conclusion. The villain's grand scheme is never really explained. There's this weird out-of-place message about being nice to other people or something, and then it ends on this weak, confusing cliffhanger. I'm not the kind of person who thinks that every game needs to try and tell some deep, thought-provoking story, but in Crackdown 3's case, it's also bare bones and empty that it's hard to care about what happens. The story may not have much in the way of character, but the visuals definitely do. Crackdown 3 absolutely nails its comic book aesthetic. New Providence is a vibrant neon metropolis, and a welcome change of pace from all the photorealistic games of late. Particle effects are particularly strong as well, which, considering that the game is roughly 70% explosions, is definitely a good thing. It's far from a technical masterpiece. There are some sketchy textures, and character models are all relatively simple, but that's easy to ignore when the use of color and lighting is so consistently well done. However, when things start kicking off, the visuals can and will get a little messy. Most of the issues come down to the heads-up display. There is so much information on the edges of the screen that, combined with all of the different effects and explosions, it's easy for something to get lost in the chaos. I managed to get turned around multiple times because my objective marker was hidden behind the radar. It's a shame that there aren't any customization options when it comes to the HUD, because the clutter does get obnoxious at times. It never got me killed, but that doesn't make it any less annoying. The audio is a bit more consistent, but it won't blow anyone away either. There are two real standouts: Michael McConaughey reprising his role as the agency director, and the sound design. McConaughey knocks it out of the park for the third time in a row. Seriously, his voice is perfect for this role, and it just wouldn't be Crackdown without him. The sound designers also deserve a lot of credit. as everything from the guns to the cars to the explosions all have serious punch, and it does a lot to reinforce the chaos on screen. It's hard to imagine that anyone will remember the game's music once the credits roll, and it's a shame that Terry Crews is saddled with such bad writing, but those are minor complaints compared to the rest of the audio package. And then there's Crackdown 3's technical performance, which on a standard Xbox One isn't great. During my run through the story, I saw everything from collision issues to cars randomly rocketing into the sky to enemies clipping through the environment. What's weird is that, for all of the issues that I ran into, none of them ever really bugged me. The frame rate actually seemed to smooth out the more I played, and watching vehicles take off like a rocket is pretty amusing. The app did crash once, and there are these weird random audio cutouts, but those were the only glitches that started to get under my skin. If you have a low tolerance for technical hiccups, Crackdown 3 is not the game for you. But if you are okay with a bit of jank, the various tech issues won't ruin the experience. From a design standpoint, Crackdown 3 is closer to an old-school sandbox than the mission-driven stories of something like Rockstar's recent hits. If you're used to playing open-world games like Grand Theft Auto 5 or Red Dead Redemption 2, this game is going to feel very, very different. Simply put, it's focused more on gameplay and leveling up than immersion or a sense of realism. The series' major hook has always been powering up your agent, and you do that by, well, playing the game. Shooting bad guys will improve your firearm skill, and blowing up bad guys will improve your explosive skill, etc., etc. The only ability that requires a separate pickup is agility, which has players level up by chasing down agility orbs littered throughout the world. This system works so well because it's constantly rewarding and reinforcing your particular playstyle. Want to focus on one skill in particular? It's easy. Head out into the city and do that thing and you'll level it up. Don't care about stats? Oh, that's fine too. Aside from a few weapons and optional platforming challenges, content isn't locked behind skill levels. While it's a shame that there aren't any new skills to level up, the system works just as well in Crackdown 3 as it did in the original. And yes, collecting agility orbs is just as addicting as ever. Progressing through the story is tied to completing any of the activities scattered throughout New Providence. Objectives like taking out prison camps, dismantling propaganda towers, and blowing up vehicle depots are littered across the map. Once enough of those are completed, players can take on one of Terra Nova's lieutenants in a more traditional, linear mission. Once the lieutenants are out of the way, players can confront the Megacorp's big bad and finish the story. It's a simple setup, but it ends up working out in the game's favor. Because all of the activities are out in the open, everything feels seamless. It's easy to bounce between any number of different activities, grabbing orbs and hunting for collectibles along the way. The lieutenant takedowns are the closest thing Crackdown 3 gets to traditional missions, and they're a great change of pace after you've spent a few hours wandering around and blowing stuff up.
Try, you arrogant prick. Now it's your turn.
Crackdown 3 knows exactly what it wants to be. A toy box. It's not about creating a believable world or immersing the player. It's about feeling like a superhero. The simple setup works because the game was designed around it and is constantly encouraging the player to feel like a superhero. Of course you're going to want to run across the rooftops. That's why there are agility orbs all over the place. Of course you're going to want to blow everything to Kingdom Come. That's what the countless explosive barrels are for. The lack of depth may turn some people off, and that's understandable. This approach won't be for everyone. But for me personally, the design and the gameplay complemented each other so well that I wanted to keep playing, even if the objectives or mission structure never really evolved. And really, the gameplay is why I kept playing Crackdown 3. Fulfilling that superhero fantasy is something that few games can pull off this well. Leaping 40 feet into the air, slamming down into a group of bad guys, and then taking off back into the sky to unload a salvo of rockets is a surprisingly rare experience in gaming these days, and it never, ever gets old. This is the perfect turn off your brain game. Gameplay is built on 3 major pillars: combat, platforming, and driving. On their own, these mechanics would be generic at best and boring at worst. But Crackdown 3 is so fun to play because of how those simple mechanics work with one another. The scenario I described before doesn't require some long button combo or precise timing to pull off. It's something you can do whenever you want. Even when compared to similarly over-the-top action games, Crackdown 3's gameplay is absolute ridiculousness that never sacrifices ease of use. It's one of those things that can be hard to describe even with video footage. But if I had to describe the gameplay with a single word, it'd probably be effortless. At least when it's working. As much as I enjoyed my time with the game, I'd be lying if I said that there weren't serious issues with the gameplay. For example, Crackdown 3 uses a lock-on system for all of its gunplay, but it's not great. Switching between targets is jarring, and adjusting the aiming reticle during lock-on never feels as responsive as it should. It's a limitation of the system that the developers went with, but next to other games with similar shooting mechanics, Crackdown 3 feels clunky. What's worse is that the game will straight up miss inputs from time to time. Switching between weapons should work, no matter what. It's a basic aspect of gameplay. But then your agent will stop listening and refuse to switch guns. It's annoying when it happens during regular gunfights, and it's infuriating when it ends up getting you killed. And because the problem is so inconsistent and happens at random, it's impossible to understand what went wrong and what to do differently next time. I shouldn't have to experiment with switching weapons. This is something that video games figured out years ago, and the fact that it's an issue in a game released in 2019 is mind-boggling. There are other issues, but they're much less intrusive. Platforming is fast and loose, and even though it works fantastically 90% of the time, anything that requires precision can get frustrating quickly. Driving and shooting at the same time is downright impossible due to bad button mapping, but I didn't spend much time driving anyways, so it wasn't a pervasive issue. The fact that there's fall damage in a game about jumping off of buildings seems like a massive oversight, but there are so many skills that will save you from a fatal drop that it only pops up every once in a while. Plus, there's basically zero penalty for dying, so it's not like making a mistake matters all that much. Speaking of dying, Crackdown 3 has a bizarre difficulty curve. Most of the time, mowing through enemies is a breeze, and the default difficulty mode felt incredibly easy the vast majority of the time. Getting killed via combat was always a case of being overwhelmed by a ridiculous number of enemies, not a lack of skill. Which brings us to the boss fights. The lieutenant missions themselves are fun, but the boss encounters at the end of them rely too heavily on a bullet sponge target that calls in wave after wave of backup. More often than not, I wasn't killed by the boss itself. I died because when I was trying to damage the boss, I got shot in the back by a sniper I couldn't see. It's obnoxious, and even though there are only a handful of these bosses throughout the game, the random difficulty spikes and cheap deaths mean that they're easily the worst part of the campaign. All in all, I'm really torn about my time with Crackdown 3. At roughly 8 hours, it's not a long game by any stretch of the imagination, and I didn't feel much of a desire to go back and explore once the campaign was over. As someone who has no interest in the multiplayer whatsoever, I know I would have felt gypped if I'd paid full price. But I didn't pay full price. Thanks to Game Pass, I was essentially able to play the game for $10. And at that price point, it's not a bad deal. Crackdown 3 is harmless fun. I still have a lot of issues with the game, but the fun parts are so much friggin' fun and so uniquely Crackdown that it was easy to push past those problems even at their worst. Anyone who values polish or a wealth of content in their games should probably pass on Crackdown 3. But if you've got a Game Pass subscription and want to spend a weekend soaring through the air and watching stuff explode, Crackdown 3 is exactly what you're looking for. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. This was originally going to be sort of a loose first impressions video. I really wasn't expecting to beat the game as quickly as I did, so now it's a review. As always, if you want to see my videos as soon as they're uploaded, make sure to hit the subscribe button. If you want to help the channel grow, share the video around on Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and all those fun social media sites. I have my next video planned. It's going to be out in the next few weeks. I'm already pretty far along into finishing it, so look for that around the beginning of March, and yeah, I'll see you guys then.